You're going to release them, give us a heads up. And they do that because that protects everyone. It protects law enforcement resources. It protects the public from letting a guy out. It protects law enforcement when they go to arrest this guy out on the street. If they can do it in the jail or in the local facility, much better. And frankly, it protects the illegal migrant. And how do we know all that? Because it just happened in Denver not too long ago. Denver's a sanctuary city. I sent him a detainer. Well, they had this guy in custody for 310 days. I sends them a detainer. The Denver, because of their sanctuary city policy, says, no, we're not going to give you a notice. We're going to send you this. We'll give you notice like 1 hour before. And they release the guy to the streets. We actually have the form where it says stamp, release to, and there's a blank. They write in the streets. And then law enforcement goes to arrest him. And guess what happens? Law enforcement officer gets hurt, took resources, money to do that when they could have just went to jail because they had to send more agents. And it hurt the migrant himself because they ended up tasing this guy. When they could have just kept him in the jail, ICE comes there, goes from the jail to handcuffs you to take him to wherever they're going to take him. But no, we can't do that because we're a sanctuary city. And now it's gotten even worse. Now if you're a sanctuary state, they come after law enforcement like Sheriff Wagner, who's trying to do the right thing. Use the resources in a proper way, protect the migrant, protect law enforcement, protect the public. No, we're a sanctuary city. We're going to release them to the streets, even though they had a detainer months before that said, just give us a heads up and we'll come down and do it the easy way. That's why this sanctuary city policy, sanctuary state policy is so darn ridiculous. So I appreciate the chairman having this hearing. I appreciate our witnesses, particularly law enforcement, who we have here on the front lines of this every single day. Thank you all for what you do, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Raskin, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Jayapal, and greetings to the witnesses. Donald Trump's ruinous tariffs and calamitous trade war against the world, except for Russia, have crashed the stock market and cost American workers and retirees and farmers $11 trillion in 1 week. 1 week. And the Republican majority in the House could stop this nightmare today by exercising our powers over international commerce. But they prefer to own the tariffs and own the trade war. We'll see how well that works out for them going into the future. It's certainly not working out well for the American people. Now desperate to displace attention from this world historical economic debacle and the fact that courts have struck down more than 55 of their lawless, unconstitutional executive orders and actions, they invite us to discuss again immigration. So be it. In New York City, Donald Trump's deportation force grabbed green card holder Mahmoud Khalil for exercising his First Amendment rights in a way that Donald Trump disapproved of. Now they're trying to deport him, as well as other students across the country, using a McCarthy-era statute that the president's own sister, Judge Marianne Trump Berry, declared to be, quote, unconstitutional on its face. Then they tried to extra-legally deport more than 100 Venezuelans, shackling them and putting them on planes bound to a self-proclaimed dictator's infamous mega prison in El Salvador under cover of night based on an 18th century law about wartime authorities called the Alien Enemies Act, which palpably did not apply to this case because we are at peacetime. Congress still has the power to declare war under our Constitution, not the president. Despite their best efforts to keep these removals a secret until it was too late, attorneys for people on the plane filed a lawsuit. And Judge Boasberg, a George W. Bush appointee, issued an order to stop the removals while the planes were hurrying to get in the air and were still in the air. Today, the judge in that case will likely decide whether or not to hold the administration in contempt for deliberately defying the order to turn the removal flights around. On one of those flights, the administration deported Kilmar Garcia, a Maryland man, a father and husband to an American citizen, who had a legal status called withholding of removal, a legal immigration status that specifically blocked him from being removed to El Salvador. He won this status after the government falsely accused him of being a gang member and tried to deport him during the first Trump administration in 2019. Instead, he was able to prove that he posed no threat to public safety and that, on the contrary, he had a well-founded fear of persecution from the violent gangs back in El Salvador. The first Trump administration respected that ruling, but in this Second iteration, the administration violated its legal obligation and shipped him off to the Salvadoran mega prison to be locked up in a cage with the very gang members whose violence he had escaped. The administration admitted in court that this deportation, which had absolutely no legal basis, was done in, quote, administrative error. And a judge ordered them to return Mr. Garcia to the United States by midnight this Monday. Rather than bring back the man they admitted they had wrongfully deported, the administration placed the attorney who argued the case on leave and decided to double down and appeal the order. We've seen the administration conduct indiscriminate raids that round up people with no criminal records, who've lived in our country for decades, who own homes and pay taxes, whose family members are U.S. citizens, and who pose no threat to public safety. U.S. citizens have even been arrested and detained by the deportation force as part of these reckless and lawless raids. Now the administration is trying to force state and local law enforcement agencies to use their time, their money, and their resources to participate in these raids. But under Article 1, Congress has exclusive power over naturalization and immigration. And under the 10th Amendment, the federal government has no power to, quote, commandeer the machinery, personnel, or resources of the state and local government for federal law enforcement purposes. But the administration is using threats and coercion now to try to force state and local governments and police departments to use their limited resources to arrest and detain students, fathers, mothers, and law-abiding community members, which means fewer cops, less money, fewer resources to focus on protecting communities from actual violent threats and gangs and the scourge of gun violence and drugs and drunk driving and so on. There's no power in our Constitution to do that, something I thought our colleagues believed in and respected in the system of American federalism. These authoritarian policies have nothing to do with law and order. They're about intimidation and retaliation against disfavored populations, state and local governments, immigrant communities, students, lawyers who dare oppose the administration in court, and judges who stand up to rule against Trump's continuing reign of unlawful actions. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. We'll now introduce today's witnesses, and I'll begin by deferring to Mr. Baumgartner to introduce our first witness.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to introduce the outstanding Sheriff of Adams County, Mr. Dale Wagner. Sheriff Wagner is a respected law enforcement leader who made the decision to cooperate with federal immigration authorities to protect his community. Adams County is a small rural county in eastern Washington that I have the privilege to represent. Its people are the best of our district and indeed the best of America, and it is Dale Wagner in which they have put their trust to enforce laws and protect their community. And for that, Dale Wagner now finds himself the target of a legal campaign by our
Mr. Chairman, this is not an introduction, so if the gentleman...
Law enforcement has involved fighting violent gangs, drug traffickers, illegal gun trafficking from other states that have weaker laws than Maryland. But you've also studied law enforcement and worked on it, not just at the micro level, but at the macro level. I wonder if you could explain how this works. My colleagues are talking about horrific, gruesome cases of undocumented people who engage in murder or rape, serious crimes like that. If someone is engaged in a crime like that and they have a warrant for the person's arrest and they bring it to a local or state official who's got control over their custody, if they're in their custody for another reason, doesn't the local government have to cooperate with that warrant and turn that person over immediately to the federal authorities?
Yes. On a warrant, yes, we do. I don't know one case where we have not done so with a warrant.
Yeah, I was searching. I couldn't find a single case where there was any local government that did not cooperate with a warrant that was to demand turning over the body of a person who had engaged in a serious crime. In fact, I saw an article about President Trump who, has been touting his ICE arrests, half of them were people who were in local custody, and he asked for them to be turned over. They were being held for serious crimes or other kinds of crimes, and then they were deported, and he got them, based on a warrant. So if we're not talking about a warrant situation, right, then I come back to my puzzlement about why my colleagues who control the U.S. Congress right now are not engaged in trying to come up with a comprehensive immigration reform package. I mean, I'll give you an example. At the end of the last Congress, we had a bipartisan deal on toughening up the border with more officers, more patrols, more asylum judges, lots of new technology. The most conservative members of the U.S. Senate on the Republican side were championing it, advancing it. It had bipartisan support in the Senate. And then Donald Trump tanked it, basically saying for political reasons he didn't want it. He did not want a comprehensive immigration border solution. He wanted a problem to run against. And I see a lot of that in today's discussion. It's amazing to me that rather than engage in the hard work, maybe not even so hard anymore, of coming up with a bipartisan immigration solution, we would rather be beating up on local governments for not doing the job of the federal government. Now, but let's say that someone thought, okay, well, we really should commandeer the resources, the personnel, the machinery of the local governments, even though it's against the Constitution and against the 10th Amendment. But let's say they think that, and they want to use law enforcement not to turn over murderers and rapists and so on, but for routine immigration enforcement. All right, how would that work if, say, they came to a particular city or county and say the vast majority of the undocumented people here we know are working in hotels or agriculture on farms or the construction sector. Could a city have the resources to say, we're going to send in raids of police on construction sites, on farms, in hotels to arrest all of these people that we think are here illegally?
We don't have the resources for that. We don't have the people for that. We're struggling to find people, to hire people, and we just don't have the resources. We have calls waiting. We're call hopping, one day after next.
The federal government's got a lot of money. We spend millions and millions of dollars just flying Donald Trump down to Florida to Mar-a-Lago to go play golf while he's crashing the stock market. Why doesn't the federal government spend that money? A locality might say. The cities are pretty hard up for money, right? They don't want to be invading all of the hotels and construction sites to go and look for undocumented workers. Do you think that's a fair request to put on the localities?
No, it's not.
It seems to me that the problem here is we have people not doing their jobs in Washington, and they want to blame local governments and put the pressure on them. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Chairman Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sheriff, are you familiar with the Department of Homeland Security Immigration Detainer Notice of Action form? You familiar with these forms?
I've heard of them, yes.
Yeah, okay. And these forms, about halfway down the page, it says, it is therefore requested that you, this is going to local law enforcement, requested that you notify DHS as early as practicable, at least 48 hours if possible, before the alien in your custody is released. All right? Is that partisan or is that just common sense?
Depends on who you ask, but it is common sense.
The ranking member said we need to function in a bipartisan way. I don't think that's partisan. That's just saying, hey, you got a bad guy, at least someone who's been charged with crime in your possession. He's also an illegal migrant. Can you give us a 48 hours heads up before you release him to the streets?
Sure.
That makes sense to me, right? I don't think that's partisan. I think that's just common sense. Mr. Hallman, are you familiar how this form works? This detainer process is supposed to work? All right, the next line says, maintain custody of the alien for a period not to exceed 48 hours beyond the time. Again, we're requesting you do that. They're not demanding. We're just requesting you help us out. Law enforcement, working with other law enforcement to protect the safety of law enforcement and, of course, the public at large, beyond the time when he or she would otherwise have been released from your custody to allow DHS to assume custody. Again, that seems like common sense to me. But sanctuary policies prevent these two requests from taking place. Is that right? you're a sanctuary state, sanctuary city, you don't comply with these. You may give them we're going to give you a 10-minute notice. We're going to release them and then tell you we already released them. That's how it works in these sanctuary cities, in these sanctuary states. Is that right, Mr. Hammond?
That's correct, too. It's even interesting, too, under the Biden administration, you have a lot of state and local law enforcement who think that they're not going to comply with ICE based on their experiences under the Biden administration. ICE had policies in place that made it so hard for enforcement and removal officers to actually work with these jails.
Yeah.
They made it next to impossible. So you have all of these jails that think, oh, I don't know if I'm going to comply. I may get penalized if a state puts an aggressive restriction on that. But everything is going to be streamlined. They want to comply. It will be a good process.
Yeah, let's put up on the screen. Are you familiar with the name Abraham Gonzalez, Mr. Hammond? Do you know this guy? Abraham Gonzalez?
I do not.
Okay, this guy was released this year, February 28, 25. He was released. Look at what the sheriff's department put here. This is a ICE notification. They put the stamp on there, being released to the streets. Now, this guy had been in custody for 345 days. And ICE had sent this very form asking, hey, can you give us a 48-hour heads up before this guy who was charged with aggravated assault, charged with stealing an automobile, charged with menacing, can you just give us a heads up? And guess what Sanctuary City Denver did? They called him 1 hour before, and ICE couldn't get there, and they released this guy to the streets as they stamped on the form. Now, what I find interesting, can we put that back up again? What I find interesting is under the section flag, see it over there on the right-hand side? It says he's cleared, but then look what it says, violent to staff. So the very people who released him to the streets knew this guy. He'd been charged again with aggravated assault, stealing a car, but he'd also been violent to the very people in the jail who were holding him, and they still wouldn't give notice to ICE. And then, as I said in my opening statement, this guy is released to the streets. ICE goes out to arrest him. Officer gets hurt. They had to tase the guy so the migrant gets hurt. Tell me how that is not, tell me why that we should have that kind of policy happen, Mr. Hammond.
Well, we shouldn't. It doesn't keep our communities safer in any sense. And again, what they're trying to do here is they say, hey, at least we tried. An hour, heads up, or whatever. But how can they look at that man to release him on the streets, knowing the crimes that have been committed, knowing that risk? How can they say, hey, we'll see you later, as he goes off and could potentially commit another crime down the line? I mean, is it worth it to instill trust with the immigrant community? How about, the citizens, and how about the harm that they could face due to the unknown of releasing a dangerous criminal alien to the streets?
They knew this guy had a propensity to be violent to law enforcement because he had done it in their very jail, and they can't give federal law enforcement a heads up. Sheriff Wagner, would you have given him a heads up?
I think in that circumstance I would.
Yeah, you certainly would, but for people who do what you would do, you're now getting sued for that, right? Your attorney general is coming after you.
Yeah, and as the gentleman over here said, we should stay out of local business, right? And so here I am with the state attorney coming down on me for trying to juggle the whole mess.
Because that's how law enforcement, you're supposed to work with other law enforcement when you can, not violating the Constitution, just be in good common sense way to make sure people are safe, law enforcement safe, public is safe, and frankly, as I said before, even the migrant is safer when you do it that way, when you do it the common sense way versus the sanctuary city way. And that's what we really have to, I think, that's really the decision here. Common sense or sanctuary city way. I think common sense wins out every time. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Chairman, the Trump administration, after pardoning hundreds of violent criminals, has launched a reckless, chaotic, and inhumane immigration policy that is making our communities less